Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to take a look at the festival of sheepshearing and consider its relevance and importance in relation to the pre-trib rapture. I plan on doing a deeper study on this in future, should time permit, but for now I will present the writings of Geoffrey on the subject, and also present some of the Apocrypha, the Testament of Judah. Before that though, an introduction to the festival, and a brief justification for my assertion that the festival of sheepshearing represents the pre-trib harvest. The festival of sheepshearing, ha-Gez or ha-Gez, was the biblical festival or celebration of the shearing of the sheep. ha-Gez took place once a year, at the beginning of the spring, once the winter cold was gone. Although lacking the liturgical importance of the pilgrim festivals relating to the harvest of cereals at the beginning of the agricultural season, or to the harvest of grapes and the ingathering of fruits at the end of the period, the shearing of the sheep was nonetheless a memorable convivium that brought together people of different localities to enjoy banquets fit for royalty. The first fruits of the shearing of the flock were entitlements of the priests, just as it were the first fruits of grain, wine, and oil, and portions of the animals sacrificed. John chapter 10 verses 26 through 28. But ye believe not, because ye are not of my sheep, as I said unto you. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. Genesis chapter 4 verses 1 through 7. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel, and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wrath, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wrath, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. As we can see from John 10, as believers in Christ, we are followers of Christ, as sheep. And in Genesis 4, we can see that the offering of the flock was preferred to the offering of the ground. It is apparent, therefore, that those of the pre-trib rapture can only be represented by the flock. Whilst Jesus is and was the sacrificial Lamb of God, Deuteronomy 18 shows us that offerings of the flock would be given to the priest, or in the case of Jesus, the high priest. There is no reference of the flax here being given to a priest, as Jesus, represented by the flax, was offered and given to God alone. Flax is used to produce fine linen, the righteousness of saints, and candlewick, the light of the world. If Absolom's haircut, representing sheepshearing, took place at the beginning of the year, and according to Seiss and Bullinger, the year began with Virgo, then the pre-trib rapture of the church should also take place in Virgo. Because of the connection of Samson's wedding to Timnath, the site of biblical sheepshearing, in my opinion, we can look upon Samson's riddle as also referring to the timing of the pre-trib rapture. Geoffrey Gagan, Israelite Sheepshearing and David's Rise to Power. Wherever sheepshearing is mentioned, it marks an important epoch, so state the Midrashim. Yet more than marking important epochs, biblical sheepshearings share a number of peculiar characteristics that require explanation. For example, in each of its 4 appearances, sheepshearing provides the setting for avenging a wrong. Jacob takes what rightfully belongs to him for tending Laban's flocks, Genesis 31. Tamar lures Judah into a sexual encounter to secure her rightful progeny, Genesis 38. David seeks compensation for protecting Nabal's flocks, 1 Samuel 25, and Absolom kills Amnon for raping his sister Tamar, 2 Samuel 13. In addition, 3 of these narratives relate to David. Genesis 38 explains how the royal clan came into existence. 1 Samuel 25 describes how David obtained property and wealth near Hebron, and 2 Samuel 13 reports how Absolom killed the heir to his father's throne. What is more, the one narrative not directly connected to David, Genesis 31, reads a lot like one that is, 1 Samuel 25. Rarely, if ever, are such narrative connections meaningless. Yet what is their significance? A close analysis of the biblical text reveals that sheep shearing in ancient Israel was much more than a pastoral duty. It was a significant celebration characterized by feasting, drunkenness, and the settling of old scores. As a result of these associations of revelry and revenge, sheep shearing became an ideal backdrop, both literary and actual, for events in Israel's past involving the repayment of debts or the righting of wrongs. Because both David and Absolom took advantage of sheep shearing for this purpose, and, in the process, aided in their own ascents to power, sheep shearing became intimately associated with the establishment of the Davidic dynasty, even providing the narrative backdrop for the emergence of the royal clan. Textual analysis. Because the narratives in Samuel contribute the most to our understanding of sheep shearing in ancient Israel, we begin there. David and Nabal. In 1 Samuel 25, we encounter Nabal, an extremely wealthy man who owns 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats, and has the means to employ professional shearers. During the time of shearing, David sends messengers to Nabal to request meat as compensation for his protection of Nabal's flock. Nabal refuses, asking why he should give to David and his men food intended for his shearers. David's subsequent militaristic response, Abigail's intervention, and God's vindication of David are well known and not central to our investigation. What is central, however, are the several clues in the text that indicate sheep shearing was a significant event in ancient Israel. Our initial clue is found in the words of David's messengers when explaining the timing of the request, "For we come on a good day," in verse 8. The exact meaning of this statement is unclear. Rashi held that the Hebrew of this passage was Israel's spring New Year's festival, and the biblical text provides some justification for this interpretation. The only other occurrence of this phrase in the Bible is in Esther 8:17, 9:19, and 9:22, where its connections to an actual festival are explicit. Rosenthal, however, has argued that the use of the Hebrew to designate a festival is post-biblical, probably Maccabean, and that during the biblical period it merely denotes a merry day of plenty. Whatever the precise meaning of the Hebrew, the size and significance of Nabal's sheep shearing is further indicated by its comparison to the Hebrew, the Feast of the King, in verse 36. Part of what makes Nabal's sheep shearing on par with royalty is the abundance of both food and alcohol. Thus, when Abigail sets out to intercept David, she finds at her disposal 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 fig cakes, in verse 18. Then upon her return, she forbears telling Nabal about her rendezvous with David, since he was extremely drunk. Of course, if this was our only evidence for the activities surrounding sheep shearing, then we might ascribe Nabal's excesses to the debauchery of a fool. However, as the next narrative makes plain, such excesses were an integral part of Israelite sheep shearing. David and Absolom. We encounter sheep shearing again during the reign of David, when Absolom holds his own feast. As before, the size and significance of the event are betrayed by the narrative details. Absolom, like Nabal, hires professional shearers. In addition, just as Nabal's sheep shearing is likened to the Feast of the King, so Absolom's sheep shearing is an event worthy of the king and all the male members of the royal house. What's more, Absolom's feast, like Nabal's, involves heavy drinking. In fact, Absolom's plot to avenge his sister's rape assumes the drunkenness of its participants. As Absolom says to his servants, "See now, when Amnon's heart is good with wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon, then you shall put him to death." As a final observation, both sheep shearing events in Samuel involve the demise of drunken participants, whose deaths aid the protagonists in their ascent to the throne. David gains land and livestock in Hebron, his future capital, and Absolom eliminates the heir to his father's throne, placing himself next in line. We will consider the significance of these events after evaluating sheep-shearing in Genesis. Judah and Tamar. Following the death of his wife Bathsheba and the requisite period of mourning, Judah departs for Timnah, where, like Nabal and Absolom, he has hired professional shearers. On his way, Judah is attracted to and has a sexual encounter with a woman whom he believes to be a prostitute, but who, in fact, is his daughter-in-law Tamar. As security for future payment, the disguised Tamar demands Judah's seal, cord, and staff, all symbols of clan authority, and in the case of Judah, royal authority. Tamar becomes pregnant with twins, thereby securing the progeny wrongfully denied her by her father-in-law. As Judah admits, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to seal her. While Judah's escapade with a harlot might strike the modern reader as peculiar, perhaps an Israelite audience, aware of the licentiousness surrounding sheep-shearing, viewed his behaviour as more in keeping with the season. If this is so, then the notice that Judah was on his way to shear his sheep is just as important to Tamar's plan as the direction of his travel to Timnah. Such a hypothesis makes sense of Tamar's promiscuous stratagem, as well as Judah's uninhibited response, "Come now, let me enter you." Also noteworthy are the several connections between Judah's daughter-in-law Tamar and the Judahite king's daughter Tamar. First of all, recompense for the violations against both Tamars is obtained during the time of sheep-shearing. Tamar deceitfully lures Judah into a sexual encounter in order to secure a rightful offspring, while Absolom deceitfully lures Amnon to a sheep-shearing to avenge his sister's rape. In addition, both Tamars are involved in incestuous relationships, the former with her father-in-law, the latter with her half-brother. Indeed, even David's sheep-shearing exploits may have resulted in an incestuous union, if, as some have suggested, Abigail is David's sister. As a final observation, the firstborn of Judah's sheep-shearing encounter with Tamar is Perez, David's and the latter Tamar's progenitor, connecting 3 of the 4 sheep-shearing narratives to David and the royal house. Jacob and Laban. While many are familiar with the story of Jacob's escape from his father-in-law Laban, few take note of the time of Jacob's departure, sheep-shearing. Jacob's choice of sheep-shearing is understandable if our earlier observations regarding the festive nature of this event and the resulting incapacity of its participants are accurate. Laban is eventually informed of Jacob's escape, and he pursues and overtakes Jacob at Gilead. Following Laban's unsuccessful search for his stolen teraphim, Jacob becomes angry and protests his unfair compensation for tending Laban's flocks. After making a covenant with Laban, Jacob leaves with his 2 wives, his children, and the many goods he acquired in Paddan Aram. As noted earlier, this story shares a number of features with one of the Davidic sheep-shearing events, the story of Nabal. First, both Nabal and Laban are presented as wealthy but tight-fisted flock owners. Corresponding to this, both Jacob and David have a gripe about being unfairly compensated for care of another's flock. What is more, both Jacob and David seek recompense for their services during the time of sheep-shearing and leave these encounters with 2 wives, Jacob with Rachel and Leah, and David with Abigail, and by means of narrative placement, Ahinoam. Finally, both narratives contain the motif of servants escaping from their masters. This theme is self-evident in Genesis 31. Jacob, who has served Laban for 20 years, chooses the time of sheep-shearing to make his escape. In the David and Nabal narrative, this motif does not come from the storyline, but rather from Nabal's mouth when denying David's request for food. After his proverbial retort, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse?" Nabal makes the somewhat cryptic statement, "Today the servants who are breaking away, each from the presence of his master, have multiplied." That this comment is not simply a slighted remark at David for fleeing from Saul is demonstrated by Nabal's reference to the number of servants and master affected by this breaking away. That is Nabal's description, and Jacob's actions could very well represent the state of affairs during sheep-shearing. After all, the release or escape of slaves in connection with certain festivals, especially springtime festivals, is well attested in other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean basin cultures, including Israel. Sheep-shearing and the Perezian nature of the Davidites. David's association with those breaking away from their masters during sheep-shearing highlights a subject requiring attention before concluding our study. MacArthur has suggested that Absolom invited the royal family to his sheep-shearing to kill not only Amnon, but also David. That Absolom had his eyes on the throne becomes clear with his subsequent revolt, and that even David is suspicious of Absalom's intentions in inviting him is indicated by David's refusal to attend, as well as by his questions regarding the need for Amnon to attend. With these observations in mind, it seems significant that Absolom does not merely ask David to attend his sheep-shearing, but rather twice prevailed upon him, literally broke out upon him. Most commentators attribute the presence of the Hebrew in these verses to scribal error, arguing that the text originally read, "and he pleaded with him." That they are not alone in this expectation should not surprise us, yet it is the unexpected Perez that seems the preferred reading, since the verbal root plays an important role in the other Davidic sheep-shearing events. In 1 Samuel 25, David is accused by Nabal of being among those perezing from their masters during the time of sheep-shearing. This is understandable, since he is a descendant of a certain Perez, who was conceived during the time of sheep-shearing, and who was himself a perezer, an action that secured his right to be the progenitor of the royal clan. Later, David is perezed upon by his own son, Absolom. After all, he is a Perizzite too, in connection with the sheep-shearing, and in what seems to be an attempt at securing, perhaps even seizing, had David attended the shearing, his father's throne. Yet the connections do not end here. We will recall a text that is peculiar in isolation, but that takes on new significance in light of this present study. In 2 Samuel 14, we are informed of Absalom's appealing physical characteristics, among which is his voluminous hair. He is said to have had such thick hair that he shaved it the same time each year, the start of spring, the same time sheep were shorn in ancient Israel. The weight of his hair is even calculated in sekerim, just like his ovine counterpart. Furthermore, he is described as without defect, a fitting victim for the ensuing slaughter. In fact, it is likely Absalom's unshorn hair that proves his downfall when his head gets caught in a tree and he is run through by the blades of Joab and his men. The mode of Absalom's death takes on added significance when we consider that it was likely in the same region, Ephraim, and at the same time of year, spring, that Absalom and his men ran Amnon through with their own swords. Thus the unshorn Absalom becomes a victim at his own game, and the Davidic sheep-shearing events come to a fitting end. Sheep-shearing and the Davidic throne. When taken together, the biblical evidence presents Israelite sheep-shearing events as a time of trickery. Jacob surreptitiously escapes from Laban. Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute. Absolom deceptively invites Amnon to his shearing. Licentiousness. Judah has relations with a prostitute. Both Nabal and Amnon drink to excess. And revenge. Jacob, Tamar, David and Absolom all seek recompense during sheep-shearing, giving Israelite sheep-shearing an affinity with other ancient and modern springtime celebrations. Yet, what gave rise to the peculiar connection between sheep-shearing and the Davidic throne? One possibility is that sheep-shearing, because of its associations with revelry and revenge, provided an ideal narrative backdrop for events from Israel's past requiring the vindication of wrongs or the repayment of debts. This model would help to explain why the Jacob and Laban narrative, which seems to have no immediate connection to David, though see below, shares a number of parallels with the David and Nabal story. That is, the motif had a broader application than David. Yet this explanation still does not account for all the data, especially why sheep-shearing in its other three occurrences would be connected to David, even when one of these narratives appears in Genesis. This leads to what is, to my mind, the most satisfying explanation of the evidence. The connections between sheep-shearing and David arose from actual events, or at least well-established traditions, surrounding the establishment of the Davidic dynasty, events that might be reconstructed as follows. David, during his rise to power, acquired considerable territory and livestock from a wealthy landowner in Carmel during the celebrations of sheep-shearing, a time of known excess and vulnerability. This acquisition provided David with an important foothold near his eventual capital, Hebron, and, following Levinson, may have even established him as the head of a patriarchy or military leader of the Calebite clan. Absalom also tried to benefit from the revelry and vulnerability of sheep-shearing, like father, like son, by eliminating the heir to the throne, and, had David attended, perhaps even carrying out a coup. Either of these events, and certainly the combination of the two, could have given shape to the traditions concerning Perez, who was conceived during the time of sheep-shearing, and whose actions at birth to secure the right of primogeniture, and by implication to sire the royal clan, helped to account for the Perezian nature of the Davidites in the early struggles for the throne. Such a reconstruction of events might also explain the several parallels between the Jacob-Laban and David-Nabal sheep-shearing narratives. In particular, an event from David's life has found expression in the ancestral history. After all, a number of episodes from David's life mirror those of the patriarchs, especially Jacob. For instance, both Jacob and David have daughters, Dinah and Tamar respectively, who are victims of sexual aggression, and whose vindication results in the removal of two brothers, Simeon and Levi in the case of Jacob, Amnon and eventually Absolom in the case of David, from the line of succession. Additionally, both Jacob and David have sons, Reuben in the case of Jacob, Absolom and, in a manner, Adoniah in the case of David, who take their father's concubines, again with consequences for the throne. In the end, it is the fourth son of both Jacob and David, Judah and Solomon respectively, who secures the right to rule over his brothers. Whether the allusions to David's life in the ancestral history were intended as a further apology for his or later Davidites, for example Solomon's, ascent to power, or whether they were intended as a further critique of that ascent is unclear. My sense, based on both the noble and ignoble actions recorded for the patriarchs and the early Davidites, is that the biblical authors were content with the ambiguities. The establishment of the Davidic dynasty was, in a word, complicated, and the account of this period, both in Genesis and Samuel, reflects this reality. Summary. An analysis of the relevant texts reveals that sheep-shearing in ancient Israel was a significant celebration characterized by feasting, heavy drinking, and the settling of old scores. As a result of these associations, sheep-shearing became an ideal backdrop for events in Israel's past involving the repayment of debts or the righting of wrongs. Because both David and Absalom took advantage of sheep-shearing for this purpose, and in the process aided their own ascent to the throne, sheep-shearing became intimately associated with the emergence of the royal clan and the establishment of the Davidic dynasty. The Testament of Judah, the fourth son of Jacob and Leah, chapters 10 through 12. Chapter 10. And after these things my son took Tamar from Mesopotamia, a daughter of Aram, to be his wife. Now was wicked, and he was in need concerning Tamar, because she was not of the land of Canaan. And on the third night a messenger of the Lord struck him, and he had not known her, according to the evil craftiness of his mother, for he did not wish to have children by her. In the days of the wedding feast I gave Onan to her in marriage, and he also, in wickedness, did not know her, though he spent a year with her. And when I threatened him, he went in to her, but he spilled the seed on the ground, according to the command of his mother, and he also died through wickedness. And I wished to give Shelah to her also, but his mother did not permit it, for she worked evil against Tamar, because she was not of the daughters of Canaan, as she also herself was. Chapter 11. And I knew that the race of the Canaanites was wicked, but the impulse of youth blinded my mind. And when I saw her pouring out wine, owing to the intoxication of wine, I was deceived, and took her, although my father had not counselled it. And while I was away, she went and took a wife for Shelah from Canaan. And when I knew what she had done, I cursed her in anguish of my soul. And she also died through her wickedness, together with her sons. Chapter 12. And after these things, while Tamar was a widow, she heard after 2 years that I was going up to shear my sheep, and adorned herself in bridal array, and sat in the city Enaim by the gate. For it was the law of the Amorites that she who was about to marry should sit in fornication 7 days by the gate. Therefore, being drunk with wine, I did not recognize her, and her beauty deceived me through the fashion of her adorning. And I turned aside to her, and said, Let me go into you. And she said, What will you give me? And I gave her my staff, and my girdle, and the diadem of my kingdom in pledge. And I went into her, and she conceived. And not knowing what I had done, I wished to slay her, but she privily sent my pledges, and put me to shame. And when I called her, I also heard the secret words which I spoke when lying with her in my drunkenness. and I could not slay her, because it was from the Lord. For I said, lest perhaps she did it in subtlety, having received the pledge from another woman. But I did not come near her again while I lived, because I had done this abomination in all Israel. Moreover, they who were in the city said there was no harlot in the gate, because she came from another place, and sat for a while in the gate. And I thought that no one knew that I had gone into her. And after this we came into Egypt to Joseph, because of the famine. And I was 46 years old, and I lived in Egypt 73 years.